For those who don't follow college football at all, there are different levels for different sizes of schools. And the ones you hear about in the news get most of the best players out of high schools, while the ones who go to smaller schools may be good players, but on average, they are much smaller and not as fast or quite as talented, perhaps. Here's an overview of how the NCAA divides it up. In the division that we see on television most of the time, there are only 129 schools, but they give 85 scholarships per school. And so you see the stadium capacity is 20,000 to 115,000. They're on national TV. They actually select one of 100 possible recruits that might come their way. And then in the FCS, which is one step below that level, there are only 63 scholarships, and the stadium capacity is about 5,000 to 25,000 is the largest. And sometimes they're on cable, but they take 1 in 40 of their recruits. And then there are a couple of levels below that. So it's usually an unfair matchup between schools from different divisions. But the big schools may play a game against a smaller school before the conference games begin as just a sort of a warm-up, because they have to play 12 games. And the smaller schools will play those games because the big schools actually pay them some of the money that they get from ticket sales and TV revenue, which they normally can't get. So that's how this game came about between the Appalachian State Mountaineers and the Michigan Wolverines. And this is from a Sports Illustrated article. They played in a stadium that at the time seated 16,650. On game day, 109,218 souls populated Michigan Stadium. Appalachian State had fewer football scholarships and far fewer resources than Michigan. And then the winningest and always one of the wealthiest programs in the football subdivision was Michigan. The Wolverines would pay Appalachian State to come from tiny Boone, North Carolina to Michigan Stadium. The price tag for the expected beating, $400,000. That's how much they paid Appalachian State. So this was considered the number 10 upset in all of sports history, according to one list. And then there was another sports upset in sports history, and I'll explain that one after we see both of these. So the almost insurmountable unfairness when the Soviet Union still controlled almost every detail of the lives of every citizen in their countries was that when it came to the Olympics, which did not allow any professional athletes at that time, the communist countries pretended to have no professional sports. Our teams were college students who had never played in the NHL, and theirs were players who were supported by their governments to play hockey. And so hockey was their job, so they were really seasoned professionals. Well, you heard the sportscaster call it a miracle on ice, and then there's a movie that you may have seen by that title, but he also called it a David and Goliath story. Well, the story of David and Goliath is one of those stories that is just so striking that it has become a phrase that stands on its own, whether those who hear it have ever read a word of the Bible or have any faith in the Bible or not. For those who have no faith, it's like what I call a preacher story. A preacher story does not begin with, "This is a true story." It may be true, it may not be true, but it's too good not to use it, right? Because it illustrates the point so well. So even people who have little or no faith love this story. For those of us who believe it's a true story, it goes way beyond a great underdog story. It is a story of promise. It is not based on the idea that if we play harder with more heart and use the element of surprise and superior strategies, we believe we just might win. It is based on the promise that if we are faithful to God, we have already won. We haven't seen the outcome, but we know it. Now, because this is a great story for children, we often de-emphasize parts of the story, but we'll read the whole thing in this case, and that will make it at least PG-13. So due to scenes of violence, you might want to be a little careful about who sees this or reads this. But let's read the whole story now. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. And Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me, and if he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers, and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are, and bring back some assurance from them." There was Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" Sibling rivalry started with Cain and Abel, and it's a sort of major part of several turning points in the story up to this point in the Bible story. Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, And although this one is less prominent in the telling of things, it does reveal a major character flaw in Eliab. Remember when Samuel went to anoint the next king at Bethlehem, and he saw Eliab. He thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. Well, apparently Eliab agreed with Samuel's impression. Maybe you've heard a saying about our politicians that goes back at least to the 1960s. And it goes like this: whenever most senators look in a mirror, they see a president staring back at them. Well, it seems like maybe Eliab suffered the same delusion that Samuel was subject to. But you remember God's answer. Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Well, now we see a view into the heart of Eliab. Needless to say, he's not very supportive of his younger brother, but he also comes across a lot like Saul. Saul stood head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. He looked like a king. And with the Spirit of the Lord's help, he actually began to act more like a king. He led them in a great successful rescue of the city of Jabesh. But Saul's downfall came when he was more concerned about the next opposing army than he was about obeying God's instructions. Eliab looks like a king, but he's been there while Goliath has been taunting the Israelites every day, and he has not stepped forward. And instead of being humbled when his little brother steps up, he was humiliated. And now he reveals how small he really is. David doesn't seem concerned to argue with Eliab. He just turns away and asks the others for confirmation of what he had heard. And then when Saul questions him, David shows his own humility as he calls himself your servant when speaking to Saul. He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. And what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant, he's speaking of himself, will go and fight him. Saul replied, you're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I'm not used to them. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. The term despised in this context means he disrespected him. He said to David, am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come here, he said, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. David said to the Philistine, You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. Now, this might get an R rating if this were made into an accurate movie because of him cutting off his head and carrying it around. Does God really play a role in this kind of violence? And is David, at this point, displaying the heart of God? God had said to Samuel that he had chosen a man after his own heart. Well, most importantly, does this sound like the heart of Jesus, the son of David? Maybe we can't understand why this all was necessary, but one thing that should help is to be sure that this was not at all unjust. Goliath and all of the Philistines weren't just bad neighbors because they let their dogs bark too loudly or rode their Harleys early in the morning or cheated in their soccer games. These people did truly evil, detestable things to men, women, and children in their own communities, and did even worse to those around them, including the Israelites. So God does not just punish Goliath. Now, we have a flashback to reveal what Saul was wondering about this young man. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistine, this is back before he's killed him, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." So here at the end of chapter 17, Saul seems to have no idea who David is, even though chapter 16 seems to have put him in Saul's service before this, playing his harp. Well, there are several theories about this, but the chronology really isn't something that Hebrews were very worried about in their writings. The thing that is most confusing is that when Saul was being tormented and his servants suggested getting someone to play the lyre, he communicated with Jesse, Saul did, and asked him to let him keep David with him. And he even became one of Saul's armor bearers, David did. And so how could he not know David? Okay, well, here's what I think the answer might be. Now, contrary to the song Only a Little Boy David that we sing with the kids, David was not a little boy when he killed Goliath. He was a young man, a little more than a boy in the view of Goliath and even Saul. But he wasn't even a little boy when he came and played the lyre for Saul. According to his reputation, he was a brave man and a warrior. That's what his servants said about David when Saul was wanting someone to come and play the lyre. So here's the best explanation I can see. Saul reigned for 42 years. As I said last time, I believe the symptoms that the evil spirit caused Saul to suffer were symptoms of what we call mental illness. This is actually in lesson number 5 that I did out of order. So it was the first of these lessons by request. So go back to that chapter 16. And these kinds of symptoms can come and go or become stronger or almost fade away over and over again through the years. So let's say that David came and played the lyre for Saul when he was just old enough to be considered a young man who could fight in the army if needed. Maybe he stayed in Saul's service and was an armor bearer in just one battle. Said he was an armor bearer for Saul. And then Saul's symptoms receded. Well, then maybe David was allowed to return home. So the conflict with the Philistines may have been 5 years later, maybe longer. And Saul hasn't seen David for maybe 5 years, a little longer. And David has grown from a 16-year-old, say, into a 21-year-old. So he still looks young, but he has a little mustache and a beard maybe. You know, it's even possible that Saul's eyesight is weak. We don't really know exactly how old Saul was or why he wasn't the one who went out to fight Goliath since he was the biggest guy in Israel. But Saul's question to Abner may have had an underlying question like, who is this kid? Should I know him? Could this be the son of Jesse who spent a couple of years in my palace? You know, maybe that's it. Asking someone who someone's father is was the same thing as asking someone's last name because they didn't have last names. But let's please don't get hung up on something that the writer of the book, you know, he doesn't seem concerned about at all. He doesn't see this as a problem. So, you know, because if he had, he would have fixed it. So let's get back to the lessons of this story. Ever since King Saul acted on his fear of the opposing armies and the fear of his own army rather than fear of God, we see God hammering home one theme, and that is that God does not look at the things men looks at. But now your kingdom will not endure, he says. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people. That's in chapter 13. Then he says, you have rejected the word of the Lord in chapter 15, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. The Lord does not look, this is chapter 16 now, at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, when he sees Goliath, David sees something that no one else seems to be seeing. They are seeing a threatening human giant, and they are terrified. David does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance like God does. People look at the outward appearance. But David looks, like God, at God's promise and his power to deliver on that promise. David sees the opportunity to let everyone know once again that there is a God in Israel. So what are the giants that we are facing in our world, and what are the giants that we are facing in our lives? What could be dismaying and terrifying to you? What do we need to remember to put in God's hands instead of looking at our measly, weak bodies and hands that are only getting weaker every day? Well, maybe you're worried about politics. Well, when it comes to politics, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're worried about COVID-19. Well, when it comes to COVID-19, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're worried about your finances. Well, when it comes to finances, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're worried about racial strife. Well, when it comes to racial conflict, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're worried about an addiction. Well, when it comes to addictions, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're worried about a mental illness like Saul's. Well, when it comes to a mental illness, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're lonely and you're worried that you will always be lonely. Well, when it comes to loneliness, the battle belongs to the Lord. Maybe you're worried about the future of this church. Well, when it comes to this church, the battle belongs to the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean that we just sit back and do nothing about the things that seem to be so threatening and say, God's got this. No, we step up with whatever we have, like David did. See, maybe we won't look very threatening to the enemies we face, as David did not. Maybe they will despise us and laugh at us, as Goliath did laugh at David. Maybe we won't get no respect. Maybe all we have to fight with looks like a few small stones against a nuclear arsenal. But we can run to the fight, like David did, instead of cowering in fear, like everyone else did. And the people will ask, whose kid is that? And do you know what the answer is? If we are followers of Jesus, we are sons of David, the son of Jesse, just like Jesus, the son of David. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. This is not to say that everything should be easy for us. It only means that we know how it will turn out in the end. And even if it seems like we lose battles here and there, we'll need to be patient. We'll need to be strategic. We'll need to pick ourselves up and try again. We'll sometimes need to keep our mouths shut. We'll sometimes need to raise our voices in a battle cry. But we will always get what we need in order to prevail. And we will just sometimes have to learn to recognize what victory is.